Picture, if you will, the dying light of a winter's day. In the year of our Lord, 1347, the cobblestones of a nameless market square glisten with frost, and the last merchants are packing their wares into creaking wooden carts. From somewhere in the gathering dusk comes the faint sound of a lute, its strings singing a melancholy tune that seems to drift on the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. The musician who plays it sits huddled in the shadow of a church wall, fingers numbed by cold, but still finding the notes that have kept him alive through countless such evenings. He is one of the forgotten ones, the outcasts who lived between worlds in medieval Europe, neither fully human in the eyes of respectable society, nor completely beyond the pale of human compassion. This is their story. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. A tale told in the gentle cadence of rain upon stone, in the whispered conversations of those who had no place to call home, in the echo of songs that once filled taverns and market squares with beauty born of desperation. It is a story that unfolds like mist across centuries, revealing lives lived in the margins, dreams deferred but never quite abandoned, and the quiet courage of those who sang their way through the darkest of times. In the soft gray dawn of medieval Europe, when church bells called the faithful to prayer and the first smoke began to rise from cottage chimneys, there existed a world beneath the world, a realm of shadows where lived those whom fortune had forgotten. These were not born as outcasts. These musicians who would spend their lives wandering the roads between nowhere and somewhere. No, their stories began like any other, in the warm embrace of mothers who sang lullabies and fathers who dreamed of better days for their children. Listen closely, and you can almost hear how it began. Young Thomas, let us call him, was born on a feast day in spring, when the apple trees bloomed white as lamb's wool. His father worked the fields of a manor lord, his hands dark with honest soil, his back bent with the weight of seasons. His mother sang as she spun flax by the fire, her voice sweet as honey wine, weaving melodies that seemed to come from the very air itself. Little Thomas learned those songs before he learned to walk properly, humming them as he toddled among the chickens in the cottage yard. But fortune, as it so often does in tales of the medieval world, turned her face away. The harvest failed that year, and the next, and the one after that. The lord of the manor, pressed by his own debts and obligations, could no longer support all his tenants. Thomas's father, grown thin and gray before his time, fell ill with a fever that no amount of prayer could cure. When the earth claimed him that bitter winter, it left behind a widow and 3 children, with nothing but a cottage they could no longer afford to keep. The wind through the shutters seemed to carry away their former life, like leaves in autumn. Thomas was perhaps 12 when they lost the cottage, old enough to understand that the world had shifted beneath their feet, but young enough to believe it might shift back. His mother, with the peculiar desperation of women who see their children growing thin, made the choice that countless others had made before her. She took her small family to the roads, seeking work in the towns, seeking charity from distant relatives, seeking anything that might keep them alive until spring. It was on those long, dusty roads that Thomas first learned the power of music to transform circumstance. When his mother's voice rose in song at the doorway of an inn or abbey, doors that had been closed against beggars would sometimes open. A well-sung ballad about the saints could earn them a portion of bread, and perhaps a corner of a stable for the night. A lively dance tune played on a whistle carved from willow could bring smiles and copper coins from merchants resting at roadside taverns. Music became their currency, their shelter, their hope. But Thomas's story was only one thread in a vast tapestry of circumstances that created the outcast musicians of medieval Europe. Some, like Heinrich the Goliard, had tasted learning in cathedral schools or universities, their minds sharp with Latin and logic, their hearts full of verse that criticized the very institutions that had educated them. Heinrich had dreamed of becoming a priest, of serving God with the power of his intellect. But when the benefice he'd been promised went to the nephew of a bishop instead, he found himself educated but unemployed, too proud for peasant work, and too clever for his own good. Others found their way to the margins through scandal or misfortune. Margaret the harper had once played in the hall of a great lord, her music gracing feasts and celebrations, her position secure and respected. But when she refused the advances of her patron's son, and he, in wounded pride, accused her of theft, she found herself cast out with nothing but her harp and the clothes on her back. No other lord would take her, for word traveled fast among the nobility, and her reputation, once spotless, was now forever stained. The pathways to outcast life were as numerous as the stars, each one a small tragedy that changed everything. The Great Plague years brought their own harvest of outcasts. When the Black Death swept through Europe like God's own scythe, it left behind not just the dead, but the displaced. Children orphaned, apprentices whose masters had perished, household servants whose employers had fled. Young Willem had been learning the craft of music making from his uncle, a respected minstrel in the service of a merchant guild. But when the plague took his uncle and scattered the guild, Willem found himself alone with half-learned skills and nowhere to practice them. Some became outcasts through the accident of birth itself. The children of executioners, prostitutes, and other dishonored professions inherited their parents' social contamination. Like a curse passed down through generations, little Anna's father swung the axe at public executions, and though his work was necessary and sanctioned by law, it marked his family as untouchable. When Anna showed a gift for song, no respectable household would take her as a servant. No guild would teach her their mysteries. Music became her only refuge, the one art that asked no questions about the bloodstains on her father's hands. And so they gathered, these children of misfortune, drawn to the ancient consolation of melody and verse. The roads of medieval Europe were full of such stories. Each wandering musician carried within them the memory of a former life, a different path that had closed before them through no fault of their own. They were the overflow of a system that could not accommodate everyone, the human cost of an economy that operated always on the edge of disaster. Yet from this desperation, from this casting out, emerged something remarkable, an underground culture of remarkable resilience, creativity, and stubborn humanity. Imagine a great wheel turning slowly in the mists of time, carrying some souls up toward the light while others descend into shadow. This was the way of the medieval world, where music itself was divided into realms as distinct as earth and sky. At the very peak of this musical firmament dwelt those blessed by birth and fortune, the troubadours of southern France, who were often nobles themselves, composing songs of courtly love while reclining in gardens fragrant with roses. Their names have come down to us wreathed in romance. Guillaume de Pétus, Count of Poitiers, whose verses celebrated both sacred and profane love. Geoffrey Rudel, who sang of love for a distant princess he had never seen. These were men who could afford to treat music as an art rather than a necessity, whose songs were preserved in illuminated manuscripts and whose reputations survived the centuries. Their music was like wine, served in golden cups, refined and precious. Just below them, in the celestial hierarchy, were the Trouberites, the female troubadours whose voices, though fewer in number, sang with equal skill and passion. The Comtesse de Dia composed verses of startling directness about desire and love, her words preserved because she moved in circles where women's artistic voices were valued, at least occasionally. These fortunate few lived in a world where music was leisure, where the primary concern was perfecting one's art rather than finding one's next meal. Descending from these rarefied heights, we encounter the guild musicians of the great cities. By the 14th century, these craftsmen had organized themselves into professional associations that provided not just economic protection but social dignity. The musicians of Paris, who received their guild charter in 1321, represented the triumph of organization over chaos. They could negotiate wages, establish territories for performance, provide support for widows and orphans of deceased members. Their music filled the public spaces of medieval cities, market squares during festivals, churches during religious celebrations, noble houses during feasts. Their songs were like bread, sustaining and necessary, woven into the daily fabric of urban life. The household minstrels occupied a middle ground of relative security. These musicians had found patrons, noble families who provided them with distinctive livery, seasonal employment, and a measure of protection from the harsh realities of vagrant life. They traveled in the retinues of their lords, providing entertainment during long winter evenings, musical accompaniment for feasts, and the cultural refinement that marked a truly sophisticated household. While their position was always somewhat precarious, dependent on their patrons' continued favor and financial stability, they at least slept under roofs and ate regular meals. Even the civic waits, those municipal employees who combined the duties of night watchmen with musical performance, enjoyed more security than their wandering counterparts. These men received salaries from town governments, wore official livery, and sometimes even carried chains of office that marked their civic status. They played at public ceremonies, kept watch during the dangerous hours of darkness, and represented the intersection of music and public order. But below all these, in the shadows cast by prosperity, lived those who had fallen from the wheel of fortune. Here, in the realm of the outcasts, lived the jongleurs, those multi-skilled wandering entertainers who combined music with acrobatics, storytelling, and whatever other talents might earn them a meal. Unlike their more fortunate brethren, the jongleurs owned nothing but their skills and perhaps a few simple instruments. They slept where they could, ate when they found work, and lived always with the knowledge that a broken leg or damaged instrument could mean starvation. Their music was like wildflowers growing in the cracks of stone, beautiful, brief, and largely unnoticed. The Goliards, those wandering scholars who had traded academic respectability for dangerous freedom, occupied a special place in this hierarchy of dispossession. Though they lived as outcasts, their education set them apart from common vagrants. Their songs combined sophisticated theological knowledge with satirical wit that could cut like a blade. They sang in Latin and vernacular languages with equal skill, crafting verses that entertained tavern crowds while simultaneously challenging the very foundations of church and state. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy, in the deepest shadows, wandered those musicians who had lost even the minimal organizing principles that defined the jongleurs or Goliards. These were the truly lost ones. Former household servants cast out without references, aged performers whose skills had faded with their strength, victims of war or plague who had fled with nothing but their ability to make music. They begged as much as they performed, slept in ditches as often as barns, and lived each day with the uncertainty that it might be their last. Yet even among these forgotten souls, music remained a flame that neither wind nor rain could entirely extinguish. The beauty of this hierarchy was not in its rigid structure, but in its occasional permeability. A particularly talented vagrant might catch the attention of a merchant seeking entertainment for his daughter's wedding. A household minstrel fallen on hard times might be welcomed into a traveling group of jongleurs. A Goliard's wit might earn him temporary patronage from a lord who appreciated clever verse. While upward mobility was rare and difficult, it was not entirely impossible. The wheel of fortune turned slowly, but it did sometimes turn. What bound all these musicians together, from the highest troubadour to the lowest street performer, was their shared understanding of music's power to transform the ordinary world. Whether they sang of courtly love in marble halls or bawdy tales in smoky taverns, they all participated in the ancient magic that could turn words and melody into something greater than the sum of their parts. They were all servants of the same mysterious art, even if some served in palaces while others served in ditches. The sun rises pale and distant on a morning in November, its light filtering through clouds the color of old pewter. Somewhere on the road between Reims and Chalons, a small group of figures moves slowly through the mist. A man with a lute slung across his shoulder, a woman carrying a wooden flute, a boy leading a donkey that bears their few possessions. They are going nowhere in particular, and everywhere at once, following the ancient paths of those who have no place to call home. The day began before dawn for most outcast musicians, not from any natural inclination toward early rising, but from the harsh necessity of circumstances. Sleeping rough meant being vulnerable to both weather and human predators during the darkest hours. Better to be moving before the thieves and murderers who haunted the roads had fully awakened. Better to put distance between oneself and whatever questionable shelter had provided a few hours of rest. The first task of each day was simply to take inventory of what remained from the night before. Had the precious instruments survived the cold and damp? Had any small coins or scraps of food been lost or stolen during the night? Were all members of the traveling group still present and healthy? These morning assessments determined the shape of the entire day. An instrument damaged by frost might mean spending hours seeking repair materials instead of seeking performance opportunities. A companion taken ill might require the group to seek shelter rather than continue traveling. The morning meal, when there was one, consisted of whatever had been saved from the previous day's earnings or charity. A heel of bread, grown hard as stone, softened in water from a stream. Perhaps a handful of dried peas or beans, carried in a leather pouch. In good times, there might be a bit of cheese or even a scrap of salted meat. But more often, the morning began with empty bellies and the hope that the day would bring better fortune. Water was both blessing and curse to the wandering musician. Clean water for drinking was a constant concern. Wells and springs were precious discoveries, marked mentally for future reference. Rivers and streams provided water, but also danger. The risk of disease from contaminated sources, the hazard of crossing in flood time, the vulnerability of lingering too long in one spot. Yet water was also opportunity. Musicians learned to time their travels to coincide with the laundry days, when housewives gathered at streams and might appreciate a song to lighten their labor. The roads themselves told stories to those who knew how to read them. Wagon ruts, deep and fresh, meant merchants ahead, potential audiences with coins to spare. Hoof prints of many horses might indicate a noble retinue that could provide employment or disaster, depending on their lord's temperament. The detritus of other travelers, scraps of cloth, broken pottery, abandoned tools, spoke of the fortunes and misfortunes of fellow wanderers. Every crossroads was a moment of decision, every hill crest a new uncertainty. The strategy of route selection required careful consideration of multiple factors. Market towns offered the best opportunities for earning money, but also the greatest competition from other performers and the highest likelihood of hostile authorities. Rural areas might provide safety and simple charity, but little in the way of actual payment. Religious houses offered potential shelter, but also the risk of sermons about the sinful nature of musical performance. Weather dominated every aspect of planning. A clear day meant opportunities for outdoor performance, but also the necessity of covering as much ground as possible before conditions changed. Approaching storm clouds meant seeking shelter, but where? A day of steady rain might be spent huddled in a barn or abandoned building, instruments protected, but opportunities lost. Snow brought both beauty and mortal danger to those without secure shelter. The rhythm of the traveling musician's day followed patterns as old as humanity itself. The search for food, shelter, safety, and meaning. Performance opportunities had to be seized whenever they arose. A wedding party, encountered on the road, might provide an hour's work and a good meal. A tavern full of merchants celebrating a successful sale could mean coins enough to last a week. A religious festival might offer 3 days of steady work, followed by weeks of wandering. The key was recognizing these opportunities quickly and adapting one's repertoire to the audience and occasion. The evening brought its own rituals and concerns. Finding safe shelter became the primary focus as daylight faded. A friendly farmer might allow travelers to sleep in his barn in exchange for an evening's entertainment. A sympathetic innkeeper might provide space near the fire for a few songs and stories. More often, shelter meant whatever protection could be found. A haystack, an abandoned building, a grove of trees that provided some windbreak. The hours between sunset and dawn were the most dangerous for the traveling musician. Darkness brought predators, both human and animal. Wolves still roamed the forests of medieval Europe, and while they rarely attacked humans directly, they were drawn to the scent of food and might investigate a camp. Bandits and murderers preferred the cover of darkness for their work, and isolated travelers made easy targets. Even the weather became more dangerous at night. Cold that was merely uncomfortable during the day could become deadly during the long hours of darkness. Sleep, when it came, was rarely peaceful. One member of a traveling group would often keep watch while the others rested, listening for approaching danger. Instruments had to be protected from both weather and theft. Many musicians slept with their most precious possessions clutched in their arms like children. Dreams were often filled with memories of better days or nightmares of worse possibilities. Yet even in this harsh existence, moments of beauty and wonder still found their way into the wanderer's life. A sunrise, viewed from a hilltop after a night of rain, the world spread out below like a tapestry of green and gold. A chance encounter with other travelers who shared news, stories, and perhaps a meal around a campfire. A village festival where music was welcomed and celebrated. where for a few hours the outcast musician could feel like part of a community again. These moments of grace sustained the spirit when the body was failing and hope was nearly gone. The changing seasons brought their own rhythms to this life of wandering. Spring meant new possibilities, roads becoming passable again after winter's isolation, people emerging from their homes eager for entertainment. After months of confinement, the world coming alive with festivals and celebrations. Summer was the time of plenty, long days for travel, warm nights that made sleeping outdoors bearable, harvest festivals and wedding seasons that provided steady work. But autumn brought the first whispers of winter's approach, and winter brought desperation. Picture the first snowfall of winter in the year 1356. Its silent white fingers reaching down from a sky the color of old iron. In a forest somewhere between Bruges and Ghent, a small shelter built of branches and mud provides meager protection for 3 wandering musicians. They huddle around a tiny fire, feeding it with twigs and scraps of bark, their breath visible in the frigid air. Outside, the wind mourns through the bare trees, like the voice of all the dispossessed, all the forgotten, all those who will not see spring. Winter in medieval Europe was not merely a season, but a season of testing. For the wealthy, it meant retreating to well-stocked castles and manor houses, gathering around great hearths fed with oak logs, telling stories and composing songs while snow piled deep outside secure walls. But for the outcast musician, winter was an enemy that had to be outwitted, outlasted, or somehow survived through sheer determination and desperate ingenuity. The first challenge was simple: finding enough fuel to keep from freezing. Wood was precious beyond gold to those without homes. Dead branches could be gathered from forests, but carrying enough fuel for a night's fire, while also protecting precious instruments from snow and rain, required careful calculation. Some musicians learned to kindle fires from surprising materials: dried moss, animal dung, even old scraps of parchment when desperate. The knowledge of which woods burned longest, which kindled easiest, which produced the least smoke, became matters of life and death. Food became even more scarce during the coldest months. The agricultural surplus that supported summer festivals and market day generosity disappeared as families hoarded their stores against their own uncertain survival. Hunting was forbidden to commoners, and even if it weren't, outcast musicians rarely possessed the skills or equipment for successful winter hunting. They learned instead to recognize the food sources that others overlooked: bark that could be ground into flour, roots that remained edible despite the frost, berries that could be dried and saved. The body's needs became urgent and immediate, in ways that summer's hardships never quite matched. Clothing adequate for autumn travel became desperately insufficient when snow began to fall. Wool cloaks grew heavy with ice, leather boots cracked in the cold, and hands became too stiff to play instruments properly. Some musicians wrapped their fingers in rags to maintain dexterity, while others learned to play their simplest repertoire even when their hands were nearly numb. Frostbite was a constant threat, and the loss of fingers or toes could mean the end of a musical career. The psychological challenges of winter proved as difficult as the physical ones. The long dark days seemed to stretch endlessly, hope growing thin as daylight. Companions who had traveled together through summer's easy months might become irritable and suspicious when food grew scarce and shelter hard to find. The isolation was profound. While summer brought opportunities to meet other travelers and share news, winter often meant days or weeks without seeing another human soul. Yet within this season of hardship, Outcast musicians developed their most ingenious survival strategies. Some formed loose alliances with settled communities, providing winter entertainment in exchange for occasional meals and shelter. A village that welcomed a storyteller during the long winter evenings might allow him to sleep in the church porch or stable. The key was proving useful enough to be worth the cost of occasional charity without wearing out one's welcome. Religious houses provided another avenue for winter survival, though one fraught with moral complexity. Monasteries and convents were obligated by Christian doctrine to provide charity to travelers, but many viewed wandering musicians with deep suspicion. Some outcasts learned to emphasize their knowledge of religious music, presenting themselves as pilgrims or penitents rather than mere entertainers. Others avoided religious institutions entirely, knowing that a sermon about the sinfulness of their profession was likely to accompany any charity received. The most successful winter survivors learned to think like squirrels, gathering resources during times of plenty to sustain them through scarcity. Some musicians attempted to save money during the prosperous summer months, hiding small caches of coins that could be retrieved when winter made earning impossible. But this required both the discipline to resist immediate needs and the good fortune to remain healthy and successful long enough to accumulate savings. More commonly, musicians learned to hoard non-monetary resources: warm clothing begged or traded during autumn, preserved food gathered during harvest season, even small favors and obligations from people met during warmer months. The winter months also became a time for maintaining and repairing equipment that had suffered damage during months of heavy use. A cracked lute could be mended with glue made from boiled bones. Broken strings could be replaced with hair carefully saved from horses' tails, and damaged cases could be patched with scraps of leather or cloth. These quiet tasks, performed by firelight in whatever shelter could be found, became meditation and prayer for those who had little else to sustain their spirits. Stories became more precious than food during the longest winter nights. The oral tradition that traveling musicians carried with them served multiple purposes during winter confinement. Stories provided entertainment for whatever audience could be found, but they also preserved memory and meaning for the storytellers themselves. A musician snowed into a peasant's cottage for 3 days might trade tales for warmth and food, but the act of telling also reminded the teller of his own humanity and purpose. The repertoire often shifted during winter months toward darker, more introspective material. Summer's light songs of love and adventure gave way to tales of endurance, loss, and ultimate redemption. The seasonal cycle of death and rebirth found expression in ballads that spoke to audiences struggling through their own dark months. These winter songs often became the most powerful and enduring pieces in a musician's collection. But for some, winter brought an end to wandering. Not all outcast musicians survived their first winter on the roads. The old, the sick, and the unlucky simply disappeared during the coldest months, their stories ending in frozen ditches or abandoned buildings. Their instruments might be found come spring by other travelers, passed along to continue making music with new hands. Death was so common during winter that entire communities developed customs around finding and burying the bodies of strangers who had sought shelter and found instead their final rest. Yet spring always returned, bringing with it the survivors, hardened by their ordeal, grateful for warmth and light, ready once again to take to the roads. Those who had endured a winter as outcast musicians carried with them a particular kind of wisdom, a knowledge of what human beings could survive when survival seemed impossible. Their music, when they played it again in the warming air of April, carried within it the memory of darkness overcome and hope restored. The wheel of seasons turned, and the survivors sang of its turning. In the great cathedral of Reims, as morning light filters through windows of jeweled glass, a priest raises his voice in the ancient chants that have echoed through these stone halls for centuries. His voice is pure, sanctified, acceptable to God. But outside in the market square, another voice rises, rougher, more earthly, singing ballads of love and loss, while a hat collects copper coins from passers-by. Between these two singers lies a chasm deeper than theology, wider than the distance between heaven and earth. The relationship between the medieval church and the wandering musician was one of the most complex and tragic aspects of outcast life. It was a relationship built on contradictions that could never be fully resolved. The church's need for music in its liturgies conflicted with its suspicion of those who made music for secular purposes. The Christian duty of charity warred with the theological conviction that wandering performers were quite literally servants of Satan. To understand this tension, we must step carefully into the medieval mind, where the spiritual and material worlds intertwined like threads in an endless tapestry. The Church Fathers had established clear doctrinal positions regarding performers centuries before the troubadours and jongleurs appeared on European roads. St. John Chrysostom had declared that, "Where there is laughter, there the devil is also," establishing a theological foundation that would haunt entertainers for generations. St. Augustine, whose influence on medieval thought was profound, argued that music could be acceptable to God only when it served to elevate the soul toward divine contemplation. Music that excited earthly passions or drew attention to the performer rather than the creator was inherently sinful. By the high medieval period, these ancient concerns had crystallized into formal church doctrine that specifically condemned wandering musicians. The reasoning was multifaceted and, from the medieval perspective, entirely logical. First, the mobility of traveling performers was seen as inherently suspect. In a feudal society where everyone was supposed to have a fixed place in the social hierarchy, those who wandered freely were rejecting the divine order itself. Second, the content of their performances often dealt with earthly love, political satire, or other subjects that distracted from spiritual contemplation. Third, their methods of performance, physical gestures, dancing, costume changes, were seen as using the body in shameful ways that encouraged lust and other carnal desires. The theological condemnation was absolute and unforgiving. Honorius of Autumn, writing in the early 12th century, declared that jongleurs are from the bottom of their hearts the ministers of Satan, and that they had no hope of salvation unless they abandoned their profession entirely. This wasn't mere rhetoric, but official church teaching that had practical consequences for how outcast musicians were treated by both clergy and lay people. John of Salisbury went even further, describing such performers as human monsters who should be exterminated entirely. The church's opposition wasn't merely theoretical, but actively shaped legal and social policy. Church councils regularly issued decrees forbidding clergy from attending performances by wandering musicians. The sacraments were denied to performers. They could not marry in church, could not have their children baptized, could not receive last rites, and could not be buried in consecrated ground. Their legal testimony was rejected in courts influenced by church law, and they were excluded from guilds and civic organizations. Yet even as the church condemned them, it could not escape its need for their services. Here lay one of the great contradictions of medieval life. The same bishops who preached against wandering musicians regularly employed them for entertainment in their own households. Noble families that attended sermons condemning jongleurs hired them for wedding celebrations and feast days. Even monasteries, the supposed bastions of spiritual purity, sometimes welcomed traveling performers during times of celebration. This hypocrisy was not lost on the musicians themselves. The Goliards, with their theological education, were particularly skilled at exposing these contradictions through satirical songs that attacked church corruption. Their compositions often contrasted the church's official teachings about poverty and humility with the obvious wealth and luxury of high-ranking clergy. These satirical works were dangerous. They could result in excommunication or worse, but they also provided a form of intellectual and emotional release for performers trapped in an impossible situation. Some musicians attempted to navigate these treacherous theological waters by emphasizing the religious aspects of their repertoire. Many outcast musicians learned to present themselves as pilgrims or religious penitents rather than mere entertainers. They might begin their performances with religious songs or saints' lives before moving on to more secular material. Some claimed to be spreading religious knowledge through their stories and songs, positioning themselves as informal teachers rather than mere performers. This strategy sometimes worked, particularly with more sympathetic clergy who recognized the educational value of musical storytelling. The seasonal cycles of the church calendar created opportunities for musicians who understood how to work within religious frameworks. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days all provided occasions when even religious authorities might be more tolerant of musical entertainment. Some musicians specialized in religious drama, performing stories from the Bible or lives of saints in ways that combined entertainment with instruction. But the fundamental tension could never be entirely resolved. The church's position rested on a theological understanding of music as a powerful force that could lead souls either toward God or toward damnation. From this perspective, wandering musicians were inherently dangerous because they used music's power for earthly rather than spiritual purposes. Their very existence challenged the church's claim to be the primary mediator between the human and divine realms. For the outcast musician, this theological condemnation created a profound spiritual crisis. Many had been raised as Christians and continued to consider themselves faithful believers despite their profession. They found themselves caught between their need to survive through musical performance and their fear for their eternal souls. Some attempted to resolve this conflict by dedicating a portion of their earnings to charity or by including religious material in their performances. Others simply accepted their outcast status as the price of survival. The most tragic aspect of this conflict was how it reinforced the social exclusion that outcast musicians already faced. The church's condemnation provided theological justification for the mistreatment of wandering performers. If they were indeed servants of Satan, then denying them shelter, cheating them of wages, or even attacking them physically became not just acceptable, but virtuous acts. The religious framework that was supposed to emphasize charity and compassion toward the poor was twisted to justify cruelty toward a particular category of the dispossessed. Yet within this hostile environment, some remarkable examples of Christian charity still flourished. Individual priests, monks, and devout laypeople sometimes recognized the humanity of outcast musicians despite official church teaching. These acts of kindness, a meal shared, a night's shelter offered, a kind word spoken, provided crucial support for performers who had been told by the highest religious authorities that they were beyond the reach of God's grace. The church bells that called the faithful to prayer also marked the rhythm of the outcast's day. measuring out time for those who lived beyond the reach of salvation. In a tavern in Cologne, as night settles over the medieval city like a dark cloak, two strangers sit at a corner table sharing a pitcher of ale. To the casual observer, they appear to be ordinary travelers exchanging news of the road. But listen carefully to their conversation, and you might notice something strange. Words that don't quite fit, phrases that seem to carry meanings beyond their surface content. They are speaking Rotwelsch, the secret language of outcasts, weaving codes and signals into seemingly innocent conversation. The development of Argot languages among medieval outcasts represents one of the most fascinating aspects of underground culture. These secret vocabularies weren't merely practical tools for criminal communication, as scholars once assumed, but complex linguistic systems that created identity, community, and belonging among those who had been excluded from mainstream society. For outcast musicians, mastery of these coded languages was often essential for survival. Rotwelsch, literally Red Welsh or beggar's speech, emerged as the common tongue of the medieval dispossessed. The origins of this underground language can be traced to the practical needs of wandering populations who required ways to communicate safely about opportunities, dangers, and resources. A traveling musician entering an unfamiliar town needed to quickly identify potential allies, hostile authorities, and profitable venues without alerting those who might cause trouble. The Argot provided this capability through an intricate system of coded words and phrases. The vocabulary of Rotwelsch drew from multiple sources, reflecting the diverse backgrounds of those who spoke it. Hebrew and Yiddish contributed words related to trade and money, reflecting the involvement of Jewish communities in commerce. Romani languages provided terms related to travel and wandering, while Latin supplied words connected to religion and learning. Germanic and Romance languages formed the grammatical foundation, but the resulting hybrid was unlike any standard language. To speak Rotwelsch was to declare oneself a member of the shadow community. The learning and use of this secret language created bonds among outcasts who might otherwise have nothing in common. A Goliard from Paris and a jongleur from Bavaria could recognize each other as fellow travelers through their shared linguistic codes. The language provided not just communication, but identification, a way of determining quickly whether a stranger could be trusted. For musicians specifically, the Argot included specialized vocabularies related to performance, instruments, and audiences. Different types of potential customers had their own coded designations. Merchants were fat geese, nobility were golden birds, clergy were black ravens. Instruments had secret names that could be used when discussing theft, sale, or repair without attracting unwanted attention. Even different types of performances were coded. A morning song might refer to begging, while an evening dance could indicate pickpocketing. The language evolved constantly, adapting to changing circumstances and new needs. Regional variations of the Argot reflected local conditions and influences. The Rotwelsch, spoken in Rhineland cities, included more commercial terms, reflecting the heavy merchant traffic in those areas. Southern variations incorporated more Latin and Romance elements, while northern dialects showed greater Germanic influence. This linguistic diversity allowed the Argot to serve as a kind of passport. Skilled speakers could adapt their vocabulary to blend in with local outcast communities. The secret language also served important psychological functions for those who spoke it. In a world that constantly reminded them of their outcast status, the possession of exclusive linguistic knowledge provided a form of power and dignity. The ability to communicate in ways that the dominant society couldn't understand created a sense of superiority that helped offset the daily humiliations of vagrant life. Written records of Rottwelsch are rare, as most speakers were illiterate, but when they do appear, they reveal sophisticated linguistic creativity. Church officials and secular authorities occasionally compiled glossaries of argot terms, usually for the purpose of better detecting and prosecuting criminal activity. These hostile compilations provide glimpses into the richness and complexity of outcast communication. Legal documents sometimes recorded coded phrases overheard during investigations, preserving fragments of conversations that would otherwise be lost to history. Some educated outcasts, particularly among the Goliards, incorporated argot elements into their literary works. These compositions created a double layer of meaning: surface content that was accessible to general audiences, and hidden messages that could only be understood by those familiar with the secret codes. This literary use of the argot elevated it from mere criminal slang to a sophisticated form of artistic expression. The boundaries between different outcast groups were marked and maintained through linguistic variations. Professional musicians developed their own subset of argot terms that reflected their specific needs and concerns. Terms for different types of instruments, various performance venues, and specific categories of audiences allowed for precise communication about professional matters. A musician could quickly convey complex information about a potential gig, the wealth of the audience, the safety of the venue, the likelihood of payment, through a few coded words. Regional and professional variations also serve to exclude outsiders who might attempt to infiltrate outcast communities. Law enforcement officials or hostile authorities who learned some argot terms might be detected through their unfamiliarity with local variations or professional specializations. The language thus served as both communication tool and security system. The relationship between the secret language and mainstream languages was complex and fluid. Over time, many Rottwelsch terms entered common usage through interaction between outcasts and settled communities. Tavern keepers, market vendors, and others who regularly dealt with traveling populations gradually absorbed argot vocabulary. Some of these borrowed terms eventually became part of Standard German and other European languages, carrying traces of outcast culture into mainstream communication. The influence flowed in both directions. The argot also borrowed constantly from mainstream languages, incorporating new terms as they became useful for outcast communication. This linguistic permeability reflected the complex relationship between outcast and mainstream communities, which was characterized by both exclusion and interdependence. For the modern student of medieval culture, the argot languages provide a unique window into the experiences of those who left few other records. The vocabulary reveals what outcasts considered important enough to encode: safety, food, money, law enforcement, opportunities for work or theft. The absence of certain types of terms also speaks volumes. There are few argot words for luxury items or abstract concepts, reflecting the harsh practicality of outcast existence. The emotional content of the language tends toward the desperate and immediate, rather than the contemplative or philosophical. The survival of argot elements in modern languages provides one of the few direct connections we have to the daily experiences of medieval outcasts. When we use words derived from Rottwelsch in contemporary speech, we are unconsciously preserving the linguistic innovations of some of history's most marginalized people. The secret languages of the medieval outcasts remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings create culture, community, and meaning. Dawn breaks slowly over a market town in Flanders, the cobblestones still slick with morning dew. As merchants begin setting up their stalls and housewives emerge with baskets for the day's shopping, a figure in a patched cloak takes position near the church steps. His loot case lies open at his feet, waiting hopefully for copper coins, while his eyes constantly scan the growing crowd, not just for potential audiences, but for opportunities, dangers, and the 100 small calculations that determine whether he will eat today. The economic life of outcast musicians was a masterpiece of improvisation, creativity, and desperate ingenuity. Without the security of guild membership, regular employment, or family support, these performers had to construct their own economic systems from whatever opportunities presented themselves. They became experts in what historians call the economy of makeshifts, a complex web of interconnected survival strategies that required constant adaptation and remarkable resourcefulness. Music was both their primary asset and their most vulnerable resource. Unlike craftsmen who could fall back on their trades, or farmers who owned land, outcast musicians possessed only their skills and whatever simple instruments they could afford to maintain. A lute or harp represented not just a tool for making music, but a significant financial investment that could be destroyed by weather, damaged by rough handling, or stolen by thieves. Many musicians spent weeks or months earning enough to replace a broken string or repair a cracked soundboard. The portability of musical instruments was both advantage and disadvantage for traveling performers. While a blacksmith's anvil or a weaver's loom couldn't be carried from town to town, they also couldn't be lost, stolen, or damaged by rain. Musicians learned to choose their instruments based on durability and portability as much as musical quality. The hardy wooden flute lasted longer than the delicate psaltery. The simple drum required less maintenance than the complex hurdy-gurdy. Performance itself had to be calibrated to audience and circumstance with mathematical precision. Successful outcast musicians developed sophisticated understanding of their markets. They learned to read crowds like merchants read ledgers, identifying the most promising audience members, the optimal length for different types of performances, and the precise moment when continued playing would yield diminishing returns. A song that delighted tavern customers might offend churchgoers, while a sacred ballad that earned coins from pious housewives would bore merchant sailors seeking livelier entertainment. Seasonal variations in audience behavior required constant adjustment of repertoire and strategy. Wedding season brought demand for celebratory music, but also competition from other performers. Harvest festivals offered opportunities for steady work, but required travel to rural areas where payment might come in food rather than coins. Religious holidays created markets for sacred music, but also brought increased scrutiny from church authorities. The relationship between performer and audience was a delicate negotiation that could determine survival. Unlike modern buskers, who can rely on police protection and legal frameworks, medieval outcast musicians performed entirely at their audience's discretion. A crowd that enjoyed a performance might shower the musician with coins and food, but an unsatisfied audience could turn hostile, demanding the return of money already given, or even attacking the performer. Musicians learned to gauge audience mood constantly, adapting their performances to maintain goodwill. Payment rarely came in the form of standard currency. Rural audiences often paid in food, bread, cheese, ale, or produce from their gardens. Urban crowds might offer small coins, but these were often foreign or clipped currencies of uncertain value. Some payment came in the form of services, a night's lodging, repair of clothing, or information about opportunities in other towns. Musicians became skilled at evaluating the relative worth of different forms of compensation. Diversification of income sources was essential for long-term survival. Pure musical performance was rarely sufficient to sustain life, so outcast musicians developed multiple complementary skills. Many combined music with storytelling, juggling, acrobatics, or other forms of entertainment. Some possessed literacy and could serve as letter writers for illiterate customers. Others had medical knowledge gained through travel and experience, offering folk remedies and herbal treatments. The most successful outcast musicians often functioned as informal news services, carrying information between communities and providing updates on political events, market conditions, and social gossip. This information had economic value. Merchants would pay for news about road conditions. Farmers wanted to hear about weather in distant regions, and everyone was interested in political developments that might affect their lives. Musicians who could provide reliable information, along with entertainment, commanded higher fees and greater welcome. Begging occupied a complex position in the outcast musician's economic portfolio. Medieval society distinguished between deserving and undeserving poor, and musicians fell into an ambiguous category that could be interpreted either way. Their ability to work suggested they shouldn't need charity, but their obvious poverty and social exclusion evoked sympathy. Skilled musicians learned to position their appeals for charity within acceptable social frameworks. The Christian duty of almsgiving created a parallel economy that operated alongside monetary exchange. Pious individuals were obligated to give charity as a religious duty, and musicians who could frame their requests within these religious expectations were more likely to receive assistance. A musician who sang religious songs while seeking charity was providing a service that justified the transaction. Geographic knowledge became a crucial economic asset. Successful outcast musicians developed mental maps of opportunities that would have impressed modern market researchers. They knew which towns held markets on which days, which religious houses provided food to travelers, which nobles were generous to entertainers, and which authorities were hostile to wandering performers. This knowledge was valuable enough to be shared, traded, and sold among members of the outcast community. Seasonal migration patterns emerged as musicians followed opportunities across the European landscape. Summer might bring travel to rural areas for harvest festivals and agricultural celebrations. Winter could mean seeking employment in urban taverns, where indoor entertainment was valued. Spring festivals and Easter celebrations created demand for religious music. Successful musicians learned to time their movements to coincide with these economic cycles. Cooperation and competition among outcast musicians created complex economic relationships. Group travel provided advantages in terms of security and to offer more elaborate entertainment, but it also meant sharing limited resources among more people. Musicians had to weigh the benefits of collaboration against the costs of reduced individual income. Some formed temporary partnerships for specific seasons or routes, while others preferred the independence of solo travel. The underground networks that connected outcast communities facilitated not just communication, but economic cooperation. Musicians could share information about opportunities, pool resources for major purchases like instruments, and provide mutual assistance during times of particular hardship. These informal economic relationships created a shadow banking system that operated without written contracts or legal enforcement. The ultimate economic calculation for outcast musicians was not profit, but survival. Unlike mainstream medieval merchants who sought to accumulate wealth, outcast musicians operated on a subsistence level where the primary goal was making it through another day. Success was measured not in accumulated goods, but in continued existence. A good day might provide enough food and coins to last several days, while a bad stretch might require drawing on reserves of goodwill, hidden resources, or sheer endurance. This hand-to-mouth existence created a particular psychology of money and possessions. Outcast musicians learned to spend quickly when they had resources, knowing that coins could be stolen or lost, but experiences could not. They invested in relationships and reputation rather than material goods, understanding that their social capital was often more valuable than their financial assets. The economic ingenuity of medieval outcast musicians reveals human creativity at its most essential. Faced with systematic exclusion from normal economic life, these performers created their own alternative systems of exchange, cooperation, and survival. Their innovations in performance, diversification, networking, and resource management provided models that influenced later generations of marginalized communities. In their struggle to survive on society's margins, they demonstrated that economic life could exist and even flourish outside conventional frameworks. The coins that fell into their caps were more than payment. They were affirmation of humanity, recognition of artistry, and hope for tomorrow. Let us pause in our tale to listen carefully to the individual voices that rise from the chorus of medieval outcasts. For while we have spoken of musicians and performers as a group, each carried within them a unique story, a particular dream deferred, a personal tragedy that led them to the roads. From the fragmentary records that survive, we can piece together glimpses of actual lives, real people who walked the dusty paths between medieval towns with music as their only companion. These stories, though incomplete, reveal the human faces behind our broader historical understanding. Consider the tale of Henry, called Henricus Jucundus Episcopus Constantiensis, Henry the Joyful, mock bishop of Constance. The records describe him as a wandering scholar musician who had adopted the satirical title of bishop while living as an outcast. His story suggests the particular tragedy of the educated vagrant, someone who had tasted learning and respectability only to lose both through circumstance or choice. Henry's mock episcopal title wasn't merely comic, but deeply subversive, challenging the authority of real bishops while claiming a kind of alternative legitimacy based on wit and performance rather than official sanction. The authorities in various towns recorded their interactions with Henry, usually in the context of ordering him to move along or face imprisonment. These brief legal notices preserve snapshots of his wandering life, appearing in Strasbourg in spring, arrested in Frankfurt by autumn, reported in Munich the following winter. Between these official sightings lies a life of constant movement, performance, and survival that we can only imagine. Henry's companion in vagabondage was one Johannes Liber, who styled himself Episcopus Churiensis, Bishop of Chur. Together, these two mock prelates wandered the roads of the Holy Roman Empire, their very existence a parody of ecclesiastical authority. Their partnership suggests the importance of companionship among outcast musicians, the psychological support of shared circumstances, the practical advantages of group travel, and the creative possibilities of collaborative performance. We can imagine them performing satirical dialogues that mocked church ceremonies, their learned wit entertaining audiences while simultaneously challenging religious and social hierarchies. The fact that both men claimed false episcopal titles reveals something crucial about their psychology and strategy. Rather than accepting the church's condemnation of their lifestyle, they turned that condemnation into the source of their artistic identity. Their performances likely included parodies of religious ceremonies, satirical sermons, and mock theological disputations that demonstrated their education while celebrating their rebellion. From southern France comes the story of a Troberitz, whose name has been lost, but whose circumstances remain tantalizing. She appears in a single document from the archives of a monastery near Toulouse. A brief note recording that the brothers had provided shelter to a woman who sang songs and claimed to be of noble birth, though her circumstances suggested otherwise. This cryptic reference hints at one of the most tragic categories of outcast musician, the fallen noble who had lost status through political upheaval, family scandal, or economic disaster. The document's phrasing, claimed to be of noble birth, suggests skepticism from the recording monk, but also indicates that the woman's manner and bearing supported her claims. We can imagine her story. Perhaps the daughter of a minor lord who had been dispossessed during one of the many political conflicts that swept medieval France, or the wife of a knight who had fallen from favor and died in exile. Her noble education would have included musical training, but her fallen circumstances forced her to use those accomplishments for survival rather than pleasure. The records of English towns preserve references to traveling musicians with names that hint at their origins and circumstances. Robert Le Ministrel appears in the tax rolls of several English towns during the 1340s, always recorded as owing money rather than paying it. His surname, simply the Minstrel, suggests either that his musical identity had entirely subsumed his family name, or that he had adopted this professional designation to replace a birth name he could no longer claim. The pattern of his debt suggests someone constantly moving ahead of creditors, earning just enough to survive, but never enough to settle his obligations. Margaret Harpris is recorded in the court rolls of York as being charged with disturbing the peace through loud music at unseemly hours. The use of a feminine form of Harper as her surname indicates that her musical identity was both professional and personal. The charges against her suggest the constant tension between outcast musicians' need to earn money and settled communities' desire for order and quiet. We can imagine Margaret playing outside taverns late into the night, trying to catch customers leaving after an evening of drinking, only to face complaints from neighbors trying to sleep. The Goliards left more extensive records because their education enabled them to create written works. The anonymous author of Confession of Goliath provides one of the most detailed self-portraits of an outcast musician's psychology. Writing in sophisticated Latin verse, he describes the internal conflict of the educated vagrant. I am dying of hunger, yet I compose verses. I am freezing, yet I celebrate love in song. I am despised by the respectable, yet I cannot abandon the life that has chosen me. This confession reveals the particular agony of the educated outcast, someone with sufficient learning to understand exactly what he had lost, enough theological knowledge to comprehend his spiritual peril, and adequate literary skill to articulate his predicament with painful clarity. The Goliard's education became both his greatest asset and his heaviest burden. The network of mutual support among outcast musicians is revealed through scattered references to group activities. A court record from Bruges mentions 5 musicians traveling together who claimed to be pilgrims, but whose instruments and secular songs suggested otherwise. This brief notice hints at the survival strategies that outcasts developed, traveling in groups for safety, claiming religious purposes to gain sympathy, but maintaining their professional identity as entertainers. Another document from Paris describes the arrest of a company of jongleurs who had been performing without license and disturbing the peace. The use of the term company suggests a formal organization, while the charge of performing without license indicates the increasing regulation of musical performance in urban areas. These musicians were likely operating as a cooperative, sharing both the risks and rewards of their profession. The fragmentary nature of these records reflects the marginality of their subjects. Official documents mention outcast musicians primarily when they intersected with legal or administrative systems, when they were arrested, when they owed money, when they sought charity from religious institutions. The vast majority of their experiences, their daily struggles, their artistic innovations, their personal relationships, left no written trace. We must read between the lines of hostile or indifferent official records to glimpse their humanity. Yet even these brief glimpses reveal remarkable resilience and creativity. These were not passive victims of circumstance, but active agents who created meaning, community, and artistry within conditions of extreme adversity. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest periods of history, human beings find ways to maintain dignity, forge connections, and create beauty. The collective memory of outcast musicians lived not in written records, but in the songs and stories they passed along. The ballads that traveling minstrels carried from town to town preserved not just entertainment, but historical memory. Stories of Robin Hood, legends of King Arthur, tales of local heroes and villains, all were shaped and reshaped by generations of outcast performers who adapted them to new audiences and circumstances. In this way, the very people whom respectable society rejected became the primary carriers of popular culture and collective memory. The influence of these forgotten voices extended far beyond their own lifetimes. The musical forms they developed, the stories they preserved, the survival strategies they pioneered, all became part of the larger current of European culture. Their innovations in performance, their networks of communication, their alternative economic systems provided models that influenced later generations of marginalized artists and communities. In the end, these individual stories remind us that behind every historical generalization lie countless personal tragedies and triumphs. Each outcast musician who walked the medieval roads carried within them a unique combination of dreams, disappointments, talents, and determination. Their stories were written in the wind, preserved in the memories of audiences who heard them sing, and passed down through the invisible networks of cultural transmission that connected generation to generation. While their names may be largely forgotten and their graves unmarked, their voices continue to echo through the centuries in the songs that still speak to the human experience of loss, hope, and the search for belonging. In a candlelit corner of a tavern in medieval Paris, a Goliard with ink-stained fingers composes verses that will outlive empires. His Latin is elegant, his theology sophisticated, his wit sharp as a blade. But his cloak is patched, his belly empty, and his future uncertain. From this contradiction, education wedded to desperation, learning linked to loss, emerges art of startling power and enduring beauty. The artistic legacy of medieval outcast musicians represents one of history's most remarkable examples of creativity born from adversity. These marginalized performers, excluded from the patronage systems that supported official culture, were forced to innovate, to find new forms of expression that could speak directly to popular audiences. In doing so, they created artistic traditions that proved more enduring and influential than many of the more respectable works of their contemporaries. The Goliards, in particular, transformed their educational background and social rejection into a new form of literary art. The collection known as Carmina Burana preserves examples of their work. Poetry that combines classical learning with contemporary social criticism, theological sophistication with earthy humor, traditional forms with revolutionary content. These poems spoke to experiences that the official literature of the time largely ignored: the frustrations of educated poverty, the contradictions of religious life, the pleasures and pains of worldly existence. Consider the famous drinking song, In Taberna Quando Sumus, When We Are in the Tavern, which celebrates the very lifestyle that respectable society condemned. The poet's voice rings with defiant joy as he describes a world where social hierarchies dissolve in alcohol and fellowship. Here the student equals the master. Here the fool outshines the wise. Here all men are brothers in their cups. This was more than mere party music. It was a vision of alternative social possibility, a utopian moment where merit mattered more than birth. The satirical works of the Goliards reveal artistic sophistication that rivaled anything produced in medieval universities. Their attacks on church corruption were masterpieces of literary technique, combining theological knowledge with poetic skill to create devastatingly effective criticism. The anonymous Gospel According to the Silver Mark parodies biblical language to describe how money had become the true god of Christian society. The author demonstrates intimate familiarity with Scripture, while using that knowledge to expose the gap between Christian ideals and Christian practice. These satirical works required enormous courage to create and perform. The Goliards were attacking some of the most powerful institutions in medieval society, risking excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. Yet they continued to produce works of biting social commentary, suggesting that their artistic compulsion was stronger than their sense of self-preservation. The wandering minstrels developed their own sophisticated artistic traditions that influenced European culture for centuries. The ballad form that became central to European folk music was largely shaped by traveling performers who adapted their material for different audiences and circumstances. These songs had to be memorable enough to be learned quickly, flexible enough to be modified for different occasions, and powerful enough to hold the attention of audiences who might walk away at any moment. The Robin Hood ballads exemplify this artistic achievement. These stories, preserved and transmitted by outcast musicians, created a compelling mythology that spoke to popular aspirations for justice and social fairness. The minstrels who carried these tales from town to town were not merely preserving entertainment, but articulating a critique of feudal society that resonated with common people's experiences. The musical innovations of outcast performers often preceded and influenced more formal developments. Traveling musicians, unbound by the conservative traditions of court and church, experimented freely with new musical forms, instrumental combinations, and performance techniques. They borrowed melodies from different regions, adapted songs for various instruments, and created hybrid forms that combined sacred and secular elements. This musical cross-pollination contributed significantly to the development of European musical traditions. The hurdy-gurdy, often associated with wandering musicians, exemplifies this innovative spirit. This mechanical string instrument allowed a single performer to produce both melody and harmony, making it ideal for solo entertainment. The instrument's distinctive sound and mechanical operation fascinated audiences while providing practical advantages for traveling performers. The performance techniques developed by outcast musicians represented a sophisticated understanding of audience psychology. These performers learned to read crowds with scientific precision, adjusting their material in real time based on audience response. They developed techniques for drawing attention, maintaining interest, and managing hostile reactions that modern entertainers still study and employ. Their survival depended on their ability to connect with audiences across barriers of class, education, and social status. The integration of multiple art forms, music, Storytelling, physical comedy, dance, created a holistic entertainment experience that was more engaging than any single artistic element. Outcast musicians became masters of what we might now call performance art, creating immersive experiences that transported audiences beyond their daily concerns. The preservation of folk traditions by wandering musicians represented an invaluable cultural service. In an age when most people were illiterate, and oral tradition was the primary means of cultural transmission, traveling performers served as living libraries. They carried songs, stories, jokes, and customs across vast distances, maintaining cultural connections between isolated communities. Their repertoires included not just entertainment, but practical information, weather lore, medical knowledge, historical memories, and social commentary. This cultural preservation wasn't passive, but creative. Each performance involved adaptation, embellishment, and innovation as performers adjusted their material for new audiences and circumstances. The result was a living tradition that evolved continuously while maintaining its essential character. The artistic legacy of outcast musicians extends far beyond their immediate historical period. Many of the performance traditions they developed influenced later forms of popular entertainment. The traveling troupes of Renaissance actors, the ballad singers of the early modern period, and even modern buskers and street performers can trace their artistic ancestry back to these medieval outcasts. The techniques they developed for connecting with audiences, the forms they created for memorable entertainment, and the economic models they pioneered for independent artistic work provided templates that continued to influence performers for centuries. The Carmina Burana found new life in the 20th century when Karl Orff adapted them for his famous cantata, introducing medieval Goliard poetry to modern audiences. This revival demonstrated the enduring power of art created by social outcasts, works that spoke to universal human experiences with such authenticity that they transcended their original historical context. Perhaps most remarkably, these outcast musicians created beauty not despite their difficult circumstances, but because of them. Their exclusion from conventional social structures freed them to experiment with new forms and express forbidden truths. Their poverty forced them to focus on the essential elements of their art rather than superficial decorations. Their mobility exposed them to diverse influences that enriched their creative work. Their marginality gave them perspectives on society that those within conventional structures could not achieve. The art of medieval outcast musicians reminds us that creativity often flourishes most brilliantly at the margins of society. These forgotten performers, excluded from the patronage systems that supported official culture, created works of lasting beauty and significance that continue to speak to human experiences of loss, hope, rebellion, and the search for meaning. Their legacy suggests that the most authentic artistic voices often come from those who have nothing left to lose except their humanity. In their songs, we hear not just entertainment, but the sound of human spirits refusing to be broken by circumstance. As the 15th century draws to its close, the world that had created and sustained outcast musicians begins to transform. The same social changes that will eventually give birth to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern state system also spell doom for the precarious freedom that had allowed wandering performers to survive in the margins of medieval society. The wheel of history turns, and those who had lived by adaptation must now face the harsh reality that their world is disappearing. The transition from medieval to early modern Europe brought fundamental changes in how societies understood order, authority, and social control. The concept of gut policy, good order, that emerged around 1500 represented a new approach to governance that viewed the traditional tolerance of vagrants and marginal populations as dangerous disorder that undermined social stability. This shift in political thinking had profound consequences for outcast musicians and other wandering populations. The old medieval world had operated on principles that inadvertently provided space for outcasts to survive. Medieval society, despite its rigid hierarchies, had been characterized by a certain practical flexibility born of necessity. Lords needed entertainment, communities required news and cultural connection, and Christian charity demanded assistance to the poor. This created a system where outcasts, while officially condemned, could find ways to make themselves useful and thus tolerated. The feudal economy's emphasis on personal relationships rather than abstract regulations had allowed for informal accommodations that benefited all parties. A lord might officially disapprove of wandering minstrels while privately enjoying their performances and finding them useful for gathering information about conditions in distant parts of his territory. A monastery might preach against secular musicians while occasionally providing them with food and shelter. But the emerging early modern state demanded more systematic approaches to social control. The new political thinking of the late 15th and early 16th centuries viewed such informal accommodations as weaknesses that had to be eliminated. Centralized governments required clear categories of citizenship and systematic methods of monitoring and controlling population movement. The traditional tolerance of wandering populations was reframed as a failure of governance that undermined public order. Legislation targeting outcast musicians and other marginal populations became more comprehensive and harsh during this transitional period. Laws that had previously been sporadic and locally enforced were replaced by coordinated imperial and royal decrees that applied across broad territories. The Diet of Freiburg in 1498, which ordered Roma people to leave the Holy Roman Empire entirely, exemplified this new approach to managing undesirable populations. The economic changes of the early modern period also reduced opportunities for traditional forms of wandering performance. The growth of printing technology meant that news and information could be transmitted more efficiently through written documents rather than oral reports from traveling performers. The increasing sophistication of urban entertainment industries provided alternatives to traditional minstrel performances. The rise of professional theater companies with official patronage and legal protection displaced many of the functions that outcast musicians had previously served. Changes in religious practice and theological emphasis also affected the environment for wandering performers. While medieval Christianity had officially condemned secular musicians while practically tolerating them, the religious movements of the late medieval and early modern periods took a harder line against such accommodations. Both Protestant reformers and Catholic counter-reformers emphasized the importance of consistent application of moral principles, reducing the space for the practical compromises that had allowed outcasts to survive. The increasing literacy of European populations created new forms of cultural transmission that competed with oral tradition. Ballads and stories that had previously been preserved and transmitted only through traveling performers could now be printed and distributed in written form. While this development helped preserve many traditional works, it also reduced the economic value of the memorization and performance skills that had been outcast musicians' primary assets. Audiences who could read ballad sheets for themselves were less willing to pay for oral performance of the same material. The development of more sophisticated musical notation and theoretical systems also began to marginalize the intuitive, ear-based musical traditions that many outcast musicians represented. As musical culture became increasingly standardized and professionalized, There was less room for the regional variations and personal innovations that had characterized wandering performance. Yet the response of outcast musicians to these changes revealed their remarkable adaptability. Some traveling performers attempted to transform themselves into more respectable entertainers by seeking official licenses, joining emerging theater companies, or adapting their performances to new audience expectations. Others moved into occupations that utilized their traditional skills in new contexts, teaching music, copying manuscripts, or serving as town criers and public announcers. The most successful adaptations often involved combining traditional performance skills with new technologies and social structures. Musicians who could both perform and write music found opportunities in the growing market for printed songs. Performers who understood both traditional oral culture and emerging literate culture could serve as bridges between these two worlds. But for many outcast musicians, the changing world offered no viable alternatives. The systematic persecution that characterized the early modern approach to vagrancy was more thorough and unforgiving than the sporadic hostility of medieval times. Where medieval authorities might arrest and expel unwanted performers, early modern governments increasingly favored permanent solutions: imprisonment, forced labor, or even execution for repeat offenders. The new emphasis on religious conformity also made the theological arguments against wandering performers more politically potent. In an age of religious wars and sectarian conflict, the moral ambiguity that had surrounded outcast musicians in medieval times was reinterpreted as dangerous social contamination that threatened community stability. The transformation was neither immediate nor complete. Traditional forms of wandering performance continued in some regions well into the early modern period, particularly in areas where central government control remained weak. Some communities continued to welcome traveling musicians despite official disapproval, maintaining older patterns of interaction based on practical need rather than ideological consistency. The cultural legacy of medieval outcast musicians also persisted in new forms. The ballad traditions they had developed continued to evolve, adapting to new social conditions while maintaining their essential character. The performance techniques they had pioneered influenced emerging forms of professional entertainment. The alternative economic models they had created provided templates for later generations of independent artists. The end of the medieval world of outcast musicians marked the close of a unique chapter in European cultural history. For several centuries, these marginalized performers had occupied a distinctive ecological niche in European society, officially condemned yet practically tolerated, socially excluded yet culturally essential. Their experiences revealed both the harshness and the flexibility of medieval social systems, the power of human adaptability, and the complex relationships between official ideology and practical necessity. The disappearance of this world represented both loss and transformation. The flexibility and humanity that had allowed medieval society to accommodate its outcasts was replaced by more systematic but less forgiving approaches to social control. Yet the cultural innovations and artistic traditions that these outcast musicians had created continued to influence European culture long after their creators had vanished from the roads. As the wheel of fortune turned and the medieval world gave way to modernity, the songs of the outcasts became echoes. Their stories became legends, and their struggles became memories, preserved in the very ballads they had once sung for survival. In the fading light of a summer evening, as the last notes of our tale drift away like smoke from a dying fire, we might pause to consider what these long-dead voices still have to tell us. The roads they walked have been paved over, The towns where they performed have grown into cities, and the world that cast them out has vanished into history. Yet something of their experience persists, woven into the very fabric of European culture, like a thread that cannot be extracted without unraveling the whole. The influence of medieval outcast musicians extended far beyond their immediate historical moment, shaping cultural traditions that continue to resonate in the modern world. Their innovations in performance, their preservation of folk traditions, and their creation of alternative cultural networks provided foundations for developments that would unfold over centuries. The ballad tradition that wandering minstrels helped create became one of the most enduring forms of European popular culture. The narrative songs that traveling performers carried from town to town evolved into the folk ballads that collectors like Francis James Child would gather in the 19th century. These works preserved not just entertainment, but historical memory, social criticism, and cultural values in forms that could survive centuries of transmission. The Robin Hood ballads, the Arthurian legends, and countless other story cycles owe their preservation to the outcast musicians who kept them alive through generation after generation. The influence of these traditions extended into high culture as well. Romantic poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge drew inspiration from traditional ballads preserved by medieval minstrels. Composers from the Renaissance through the modern era have found in these folk traditions sources of melody, rhythm, and emotional authenticity that continue to inspire new works. The performance techniques developed by outcast musicians provided templates for later forms of popular entertainment. The ability to read and respond to audiences, to adapt material in real time, to combine multiple art forms in a single performance. These skills that were essential for medieval wandering performers became the foundation for many later entertainment traditions. The traveling theater companies of the Renaissance, the ballad singers of the early modern period, the music hall performers of the 19th century, and even modern buskers and street performers can trace their artistic lineage back to these medieval outcasts. The economic models that outcast musicians developed for independent artistic work also provided precedents for later generations of performers who worked outside established patronage systems. Their strategies for diversifying income sources, building audiences, and maintaining artistic independence influenced the development of commercial entertainment industries. The linguistic innovations of outcast communities left permanent traces in European languages. Many words derived from medieval Rotwelsh and other Argot languages entered standard vocabularies, carrying with them traces of underground culture. Modern German, English, French, and other European languages contain terms that originated in the secret communications of medieval outcasts. These linguistic survivals provide one of the most direct connections we have to the daily experiences of these marginalized communities. The Argot traditions also influenced later forms of coded communication, from the cant of early modern criminals to the slang of modern subcultures. The techniques that medieval outcasts developed for creating group identity through language provided models that continue to be employed by marginalized communities. The artistic legacy of the Gauliards proved particularly enduring. The satirical traditions they established influenced European literature for centuries. From the works of François Villon in the 15th century to the political satire of the Enlightenment, the Gauliardic tradition of using wit and learning to challenge authority provided a template for literary rebellion. The combination of classical education and contemporary social criticism that characterized Gauliard poetry became a recognizable mode of literary expression. The 20th century revival of the Carmina Burana through Karl Orff's famous cantata introduced Goliard poetry to modern audiences and demonstrated the continuing relevance of their artistic vision. These medieval outcasts had created works that spoke to universal human experiences with such authenticity that they could transcend their original historical context. The survival strategies developed by outcast musicians provided models for later marginalized communities. The networks of mutual support, the techniques for navigating hostile environments, the methods for maintaining dignity in the face of systematic oppression. All of these innovations had influence that extended far beyond the medieval period. Later generations of displaced persons, religious minorities, and social outcasts drew on similar strategies for survival and community building. The underground networks that connected outcast communities across Europe provided early examples of transnational cultural organization that operated independently of official political structures. These informal systems of communication and cooperation prefigured later developments in international cultural exchange. Perhaps most importantly, the outcast musicians of medieval Europe preserved and transmitted cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Their role as carriers of folk culture, preservers of oral tradition, and bridges between different communities made them essential to European cultural development. The songs they sang, the stories they told, and the customs they maintained provided the raw material from which later artists and writers would create works of lasting significance. Their preservation of popular culture was not passive, but creative, involving constant adaptation and innovation that kept traditional forms alive and relevant. This dynamic approach to cultural transmission ensured that the traditions they carried could continue to evolve and find new meanings in changing circumstances. The moral and philosophical questions raised by the treatment of outcast musicians remain relevant to contemporary discussions about social inclusion and cultural diversity. The medieval tension between official condemnation and practical tolerance of marginalized performers mirrors modern debates about how societies should respond to populations that don't fit easily into established categories. The strategies that outcast musicians developed for maintaining dignity and creating meaning within conditions of systematic exclusion provide insights that remain valuable for contemporary marginalized communities. The relationship between mainstream and outcast cultures in medieval Europe also offers lessons about the complex dynamics of cultural innovation and preservation. The fact that some of the most enduring elements of European culture were preserved and developed by those whom society rejected suggests the importance of maintaining space for alternative voices and perspectives. In the end, the story of medieval outcast musicians reminds us that cultural vitality often depends on the contributions of those who exist at society's margins. These forgotten performers, excluded from the patronage systems that supported official culture, created traditions that proved more lasting and influential than many of the more respectable works of their time. Their experiences suggest that creativity and cultural innovation often flourish most brilliantly when freed from conventional constraints and expectations. The courage they demonstrated in maintaining their humanity and artistry despite systematic oppression provides inspiration for all who face circumstances that seem to allow no room for hope or beauty. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, human beings find ways to create meaning, forge connections, and produce works of lasting value. As our tale draws to its close, we might imagine one final scene. Somewhere in the mists of time, on a road that exists now only in memory, a figure with a lute slung across his shoulder walks toward a horizon that promises nothing but uncertainty. Behind him, lie the cold ashes of last night's fire. Before him stretches another day of unknown possibilities. He begins to hum a melody, not because anyone is listening, not because it will earn him coins or food or shelter, but simply because the music exists within him and demands expression. That quiet song, sung for no audience but the wind and the birds, carries within it all the hopes and sorrows, all the dignity and desperation, all the beauty and pain of those who lived their lives in the shadows of medieval Europe. It is a song that continues to echo through the centuries, reminding us that the human spirit, no matter how circumstances conspire against it, will always find ways to make music from the materials of existence. In that endless melody, the outcast musicians of medieval Europe achieve their final triumph. Not the recognition they sought in life, but the immortality that comes to all who leave the world richer in beauty than they found it. And so their song continues, world without end. Amen. As the last echoes of our chronicle fade into the silence of centuries, we return to where we began, to the understanding that some stories transcend their historical moment to become timeless meditations on what it means to be human. The outcast musicians of medieval Europe, those forgotten wanderers who lived between worlds and sang their way through the darkest of times, offer us more than mere historical curiosity. They provide a window into the eternal struggle between power and powerlessness, between belonging and exclusion, between the human need for beauty and the world's frequent indifference to that need. Their tale unfolds across the breadth of medieval Europe, like a vast tapestry woven from individual threads of sorrow and joy, each life a unique pattern within the larger design. From the Goliards with their Latin verses and bitter wit, to the simple jongleurs who juggled and sang for their daily bread, from the fallen nobles who had lost everything but their musical training, to the peasant children who had found in melody their only escape from grinding poverty. All were united by their common fate as outcasts in a world that needed their services while despising their existence. The profound contradiction at the heart of their experience, simultaneously essential and despised, culturally vital yet socially excluded, reveals fundamental tensions within medieval European society that continue to resonate in our own time. Their struggles illuminate the complex relationships between official ideology and practical necessity, between religious doctrine and human compassion, between social order and individual dignity. In their daily battles for survival, these outcast musicians developed innovations in performance, economics, and social organization that influenced European culture for centuries. Their creation of underground networks, their preservation of folk traditions, their development of new artistic forms, and their modeling of alternative ways of living all contributed to the broader stream of European cultural development. They were not passive victims of circumstance, but active creators who made something beautiful and meaningful from the materials of marginalization. The courage they demonstrated in maintaining their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization provides inspiration that transcends their historical moment. Their refusal to accept society's judgment of their worthlessness, their determination to create beauty despite their circumstances, and their commitment to preserving culture even when that culture provided them no security, all of these represent victories of the human spirit that continue to inspire. Perhaps most remarkably, these outcast musicians transformed their pain into art that spoke to universal human experiences. The ballads they carried, the songs they composed, the stories they preserved, all dealt with themes of love and loss, hope and despair, justice and injustice that resonate across cultures and centuries. In giving voice to their own marginalization, they created works that spoke for all who have ever felt themselves to be outsiders. Their legacy reminds us that cultural vitality often depends on the contributions of those whom society marginalizes or ignores. The most enduring elements of medieval European culture, the ballad traditions, the folk melodies, the satirical forms, the performance techniques, were largely preserved and developed by those who existed on society's margins. This suggests that maintaining space for alternative voices and perspectives is not just morally desirable, but culturally essential. As we reflect on their story and in our own time, when new forms of displacement and marginalization create new populations of outcasts, the medieval wandering musicians offer both warning and hope. Their experiences warn us about the human costs of social exclusion and the cultural losses that result when societies fail to value all their members. But they also provide hope through their demonstration that human creativity, dignity, and community can survive even the harshest circumstances. The outcast musicians of medieval Europe may be long dead, their voices silenced, their struggles ended, but something essential of their experience lives on. In every street performer who brings music to urban spaces, in every folk singer who preserves traditional songs, in every artist who chooses independent creation over institutional security, in every person who finds in music a refuge from the world's indifference, in all of these, the spirit of the medieval outcast musician continues. Their ultimate victory was not in achieving the respectability they often sought, but in creating works of such authenticity and power that they outlasted the very social structures that rejected them. The songs they sang for survival became the songs that defined European culture. The stories they told for coins became the stories that shaped European imagination. The musical traditions they carried became the traditions that continue to move human hearts across the centuries. In the end, the outcast musicians of medieval Europe achieved a form of immortality that few of their more respectable contemporaries can claim. They live on, not in marble monuments or written histories, but in the continuing human need for music that speaks truth about the experience of being alive in an often hostile world. Their voices, silenced in life, continue to sing through all who recognize that beauty can emerge from the darkest circumstances, and that the human spirit, no matter how oppressed, will always find ways to make music from the materials of existence. And so, as night falls gently over our long tale, we leave them as we found them, walking the endless roads of human experience, their instruments slung across their shoulders, their voices raised in songs that echo through eternity, reminding us that music, like hope, can never be entirely silenced as long as there are human hearts to carry it forward into tomorrow. May they rest in the eternal peace of stories well told, and may their songs continue to comfort all who wander in the darkness seeking light. Thus ends our chronicle of the outcast musicians of medieval Europe, a tale told in the gentle rhythm of rain upon stone, in the whispered conversations of those who had no place to call home, in the echo of songs that once filled the spaces between despair and hope, with the only beauty the world would allow them to create.